This was never going to be a season where the Roos finished in the 8, but they did unearth some good talent, and that might help them get there in the next couple of years. My name's Woody, and this is Wooden Spoon Data, the 18th best AFL channel on YouTube. And in today's assessment of North Melbourne, we're joined by Dyaln Alexander from Dyaln Alexander Follows Draft. How are you doing today, Dylan?
Good, mate. Thanks for having me on. Keen to go over the Roos. Not that I'm always happy to talk about my beloved team, but yeah, today, keen to do it with you for sure.
That was going to be one of my questions. You're a North supporter. How do you feel about them this year?
It's been fun unearthing some of the kids that we've had coming through, like your Wardlaws, your Sheezels, your McKercher. It's been, I guess, as a team that doesn't always have the biggest stars, getting your hands on some of those guys, like really top end talents, and seeing them develop's cool. But it's been a long few years. It's been slow. I think it's difficult when you put us up against teams like Hawthorn, who seem to be able to have this bounce after kind of bottoming out a little bit. So that's been a bit hard to swallow, but starting to see the shoots. And I think middle of the season in 2024 is where we saw probably the best of North, which I'd like to see going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. You began to turn a corner in the middle of the season. Before we get into it, for those of you that don't know, let us know a bit about yourself, Dylan.
I'm pretty new to the YouTube footy world, to be honest. Like, I just started getting into it started this year. I was living overseas for quite a while, always been a big footy fan growing up, so it's kind of been in my repertoire to talk about football, but came back, sort of got into the media space and just started to get really interested in the draft. So I started taking a camera around to games, started vlogging the Coates League here in Victoria, and it just sort of, happened, just started uploading and people sort of connected with the content, and yeah, here we are.
Today we'll be taking a look back at North Melbourne's 2025 season to see where they excelled and where they could improve so that they could get back to being a top 4 contender. To do this, I've made a simple spreadsheet that compares North's players against the average of a player in the same position. We can also compare each player against that of a top 4 player in the same position over the last 5 years. I've taken some liberties to include best 22 players who missed large chunks of the season through injury, though I've tried to have minor influence. Basically, I've taken every stat and every position and then compared stats between an average player in a given position and a top 4 player from the last 5 years in the same position to determine what stats are important for each player in their position. That was a lot of positions. For example, Cam Zurhaar had 34 out of 51 important stats above the average medium forward this year, but that drops to 25 out of 51 if we were to raise the average to that of a top 4 medium forward over the last 5 years. The average medium forward had 6.86 kicks per match this year. Zurhaar had 8.5 and therefore was more than the average 2024 mid forward. But if we were to compare him to a top 4 medium forward over the last 5 years, where the average is 8.63, he is lower than the average top 4 medium forward. Make sense? Good. So we did that for every position and every stat that we deemed important for that position. Finally, once we compare the best 22 North can field, we'll compare the players selected as a whole against the average production of a top 4 side over the last few years and determine where they need to improve the most. North's key defenders this year were Aidan Corr with 23 games, Charlie Comben with 19, Callan Dawson with 11, Will Dawson and the now delisted Big and Yuan with 3 matches, and Griffin Logue with 2. None of those defenders are significantly ahead of the rest, with the best being Aidan Corr with 20 out of 37 important defensive stats above the average key defender. The next best being Comben with 19 out of 37, then Griffin Logue with 18 out of 37, and Big and Yuan not far behind on 16 out of 37, before we fall off a cliff with Will and Callan Dawson on 8 and 12 respectively. When comparing against a top 4 key defender, this does bring up an interesting stat. Charlie Comben is their best key defender with 20 out of 37. You may have noticed this is one stat higher than when comparing against just the average key defender of this year. This is because there are certain stats where a top 4 player will technically have worse stats than an average player. In this instance, Comben had 2.053 turnovers per match this year, which is above the average key defender at 2.04 and therefore wasn't better than the average and didn't get a point under our system. But the top 4 key defender turnover average actually jumps to 2.07, so Comben would get a point. The reason top 4 key defenders and most positions have higher turnovers is generally because good players get more of the footy and then take the game on. While I understand the Roos might prefer to only play 2 key defenders, I would be playing 3 and hence have gone for a best 22 structure including Comben, Core, and Logue. Looking at key statistics, I generally like what I see. Being pedantic, I would say that Core's contested marks aren't good enough, and Combin's defensive 1v1 loss percentage could be better, but I like most of his other stats, and with an extra competent key back, hopefully that helps. As a side note, Logue doesn't have a loss percentage as he doesn't have enough 1v1 defensive contests before his injury this year. So, Dylan, North have picked up a few new key defensive draftees over the recent years. Do you think this might be an area they go back to this year?
For me, this is definitely an area of need for North Melbourne. In some ways, I feel it's more of an area of need that we could have addressed in the trade period to go after a lockdown key defender, even if it was a less quality one. I think that's what we could have done, but I do think this will be an area, even if it's more of a tall utility that comes in and plays a little bit of defense, a little bit of forward maybe, I think this will be an area that we address.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but we'll be going over the names at the end, so let's move on to the medium defenders. This year, Harry Sheezel, Colby McKercher, Luke McDonald, Zach Fisher, Darcy Tucker, and Jackson Archer all played over 15 games, with Miller Bergman and Riley Hardiman playing just 3 games, with Josh Goda playing just the 1. North's best in that role is clearly Sheezel, but with a need for more versatility and his potential to move into the midfield long term, North will still need 2 running defenders and a lockdown small defender. For the running defenders, Zach Fisher and Colby McKercher currently have the halfback flank roles when not occupied by Sheezel. For the lockdown defender role, Jackson Archer is following in his father's footsteps nicely and seems to be gaining Clarko's trust. That being said, Archer will occupy a bench spot alongside Luke McDonald, who can also assist with midfield minutes if needed. While I'm still just assessing this past year, I won't be looking at the additions of new players such as Caleb Daniel or what they would do to the side, but that will be coming later in the video. So, of the medium defender key stats, besides intercept marks, score launches, and 1%ers from the running halfback flanks in Fisher, Sheezel, and McKercher, pretty much everything else is where you'd want it to be. Score launches can be fixed with better players up the field using the ball better, so this will hopefully improve this year with the additions in the off-season. But those 3 really should be working on their 1%ers. And to reiterate, we will come back to the changes post-trade period, general requirements in the draft as well. With that, we have North's starting defence in 2024, so we'll compare their best defenders against that of a top 4 defence and the sum of their output against the top 4 defence as a whole. So, as a whole, there are no major statistical drop-offs. As discussed, there could be minute improvements. That being said, North is roughly playing with 1 additional defender between Sheezel and McDonald's midfield rotations with how stats are accumulated. I see the major need here being North's tall defensive socks. After Logue's injury this year and the delisting of Biggie Nuon, I could see North doubling down on their Will Dawson pick of last year. So, Dylan, what are your thoughts on my assessment of North's key and medium defenders and your backline as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's probably the area for North that's going to have the most change coming into this 2025 season. I think if you look at some of the players, some of the assets that North have, and again, comparing it up against some good teams or good defenses, I think we probably lack a little bit of that hybrid type defender, the one that can run the ball out of the back line, be like a back flanker and intercept. I think of the best player at doing that, probably like a Nick Vlauston at Richmond. And North probably lack those just medium interceptors. You know, we've got Archer that you mentioned there. He's going to do a job as a lockdown player, but he's not going to do much with ball in hand. He's not going to do much in the air. You mentioned Sheezel, but really North want him in front of the ball more than behind it, and I think that's going to keep going. The same, I think, will happen with McKercher. I think you'll see him come up a little bit higher in the field, either go through the midfield, play on a wing, and then you've got players like, as I said, Caleb Daniel is going to come in there. You've got Zach Fisher. You got Darcy Tucker and even McDonald as well. So it's going to be really interesting how that goes. I think it's, Daniel, they're going to bring him in for the leadership. He can just sort of create a little bit. Zach Fisher's probably the other one. I like him with ball in hand. I think he takes off some dangerous kicks. I think he gives you absolutely zero defensively. And I think there's a problem there with his competitiveness as a North fan. I don't think he's, massively the problem, and I like him with ball in hand, but you start to just lack weapons with those really small guys that can just use the footy.
Moving on to the mids, North's midfield group this year were Luke Davies-Uniacke, Tom Powell, George Wardlaw, Bailey Scott, Dylan Stephens, Will Phillips, and Liam Shields. You might have noticed that Liam Shields' score is considerably lower than expected. This is a flaw in my accounting due to the sub matches lowering his average against his matches played. I will fix this by preseason videos, but it isn't exactly an easy fix and will take me a little bit of time. Looking again at who was above average for the stats we deemed most important, there was 3 clear leaders in Davies Uniacke, George Wardlaw, and then Tom Powell. After that, the quality of midfielders drops off significantly. The major issue is when we change the comparison rate from an average player to a top 4 mid. There we also see a fairly sizable drop off. Luke Davies-Uniacke maintains a fairly strong average of 30 out of 42, but Tom Powell drops from 29 to 19, falling behind average in disposals, contested and uncontested possessions, ground ball gets, rebound 50s, marks totaled, goal average, and score launches amongst others. George Wardlaw has a similar problem, dropping from 29 to just 19. He falls below average in disposals, inside 50s, meters gained, uncontested possessions, intercept possessions, ground ball gets, marks totaled, average shots, score involvements, goal average, and also score launches. These small drops in percentage when compared against the top 4 side really emphasises the mantra that there's only a small margin between most teams, and why a 5 to 10% improvement can really change a team's fortunes. The next best 2 pure mids were Bailey Scott only dropping 1 point from 17 to 16 and Will Phillips dropping from 13 to 10. When looking at the midfield output as a whole, besides disposals, shots, score involvements and maybe inside 50s, we can generally see things are where you'd want them to be. Disposals can be somewhat excused due to the potential for Sheasel and McDonald to play more midfield minutes, but the Roos would want to see improvements from score involvement and shots with the new additions coming in post-trade. Again, I'll discuss that in further depth later in the video. As a whole, while there could also be improvements here, I'm also pretty happy with North's midfield, and with their additions of Parker and Daniel joining, I can only see improvements. One of the main stats that I like about the Roos is they already average 5.61 hitouts gathered, which is 0.51 above the average top 4 side. So, Dylan, what are your thoughts of my midfield assessment for the Roos?
I think the part of North Melbourne that I love the most is the midfield. I think if you look at LDU, George Wardlaw, Harry Sheasel, like that's a midfield 3 that I think any team in the competition would, at least from a long-term perspective, really want to have. I think you touched on it and hit the nail on the head with the fact that they probably just can't sustain it, that midfield. And I probably look at the main player in that to be George Wardlaw, who's just, his best is absolutely electric. Like I love him. He's so powerful and explosive and he tackles like a maniac. Like he's so fun, but he's probably only playing something like 70% time on ground at the moment. So he just needs to get that layer upon layer of fitness where he can sort of get that number up to 80%. I think he can even play a little bit in the forward half of the ground at times just to be a bit of a nuisance for the ground ball stuff inside forward 50. But those 3 as a starting midfield 3, I'm the most excited about of any part of our team. Probably a big talking point for North that is around some of these depth players like Will Phillips, like Powell, who is kind of the 4th guy who's going to play that maybe more defensive role within the midfield, because Sheasel, Wardlaw and LDU are all sort of, ball in hand type players. Who's going to come in and fulfill the defensive stuff? Who's going to be the depth player that's just going to come off the bench and, play that 70% time on ground and pinch hit and then play a little bit in an auxiliary position? I don't think a lot of those players like Powell and Will Phillips have a lot of flexibility. So I think that's probably more of the question mark, but the top end part of it is fantastic.
So let's get to the man that feeds the midfield the ball. Tristan Xerri was the only technical ruckman the Roos played this year, as Bryn Teakle was classed as a key forward. In terms of top 4 comparisons, Xerri still has 32 out of 43 stats above average, only falling behind by 0.002 in goals to average. When comparing Xerri against the average ruck team key stats, he only falls behind by 1 mark, 1.45 score involvements, and 0.911 percenters. In every other stat, he is either equaling or surpassing that of a top 4 ruckman and the person in the ruck when the main ruck is resting. While Xerri is fit and firing, I can't see rucks being a priority in terms of drafting. At most, I could maybe see Bruce make a return or another state league ruck as a break in case of emergency type player. So Dylan, what do you think of my assessment of North's ruck stocks from 2024? I can't see them using a pick here. What do you think?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think you've got Goad, who's kind of waiting in the wings. He's a 19-year-old ruckman, a bit of a project there. But the fact that North took Teakle in that mid-season draft, they've played Teakle as a second tall forward, But now that they've brought in players like Darling, and they're probably going to go to the draft in that area that we'll get to in a minute, I don't think there's any need to bring in a ruck. I think what Tristan Jerry's been able to do, really elevate himself into the top echelon of rucks. If I was to just to judge like harshly one part of his game, I think sometimes the way that North want to play with having those quality on ballers in there to get the ball in their hands, sometimes Sherry, as he's a bit more of a sort of pressure ruckman, he does sort of grab the ball out of the ruck and just kind of give you a lot of dirty ball, like going inside forward 50. And I think that can, it's an easy way to turn the ball over at half back, and the other team scores really quickly off that. So that can be a problem, and I think they need to work a little bit on that connection.
So we get to the forward line, where in my opinion, North's team fell apart in 2024. But we also might see improvements there due to the trade and draft seasons they might have. From what I can tell, North has a preference for a 2 key position forward structure. Nick Larkey is clearly their best with 23 matches last year. From there, Toby Pink played the next most matches with 15, but did play in defence too. Bryn Teakle, who was picked up in the mid-season draft, played the next most matches with 11. Callum Coleman-Jones, who was promising early, ruptured his Achilles against Carlton in round 4 and only managed the 3 matches. The only other key position forward who played any matches was Tyler Seller, who played 2 and only got the 3 disposals. So while we're comparing this year still, we'll put Teakle in the second key position forward role. I'd probably also add Toby Pink to the bench for a bit of versatility. Looking at the charts of the most important key position forward stats, Larkey is slightly behind in a few key stats, but near enough to the mark when he's mostly doing it as a lone hand. But Teakle and Pink really just don't add enough. Touching on the future for a moment, this is a position that poses as a must improve for next year. While the addition of Jack Darling helps for a year or two, I would be expecting North to look at acquiring a young key position forward in the draft. So Dylan, what are your thoughts on my assessment of your key position forward structuring and your potential to use a pick in the draft?
Pretty much agree with everything you've said there. So definitely think they need to go to the draft here, and I think that'll be the conversation around splitting that pick 2, because at the moment we only have pick 2 and pick 62 or something like that. So that'll definitely be an area. I think, like you said off the top, like this was a disaster area for North. The forward half, any connection between midfield and forward was really difficult. You had Toby Pink. I know you said there that he's a versatile player. I don't think Pink has the quality, although he's got competitiveness and he wants to do well. He just doesn't have the quality as a key position player for me at AFL level. They brought Teakle in. I actually think Teakle played pretty well just to fulfill that second tall forward role. But again, he's not a star, and I would sort of classify him as a bit more of a ruckman. So Jack Darling's obviously the one that they've gone after, a bit of a stopgap. I think he'll come in and just be a little bit of a foil. I think one thing that Jack Darling does really well that people don't think about is the pressure side of the game. And that was something that North struggled across. If we remove just the key position players and talk about all of their forward line, even the smalls, North have got to start getting some guys that can lay a bit of pressure. And even if Darling can come in and do that for a couple of years and just be a bit of a foil, I think that's really positive overall for the forward line.
North's mid and medium forwards this year were Cam Zurhaar, Paul Curtis, Jai Simpkin, Eddie Ford, Zane Dersma, Curtis Taylor, and Robert Hansen Jr. We also had the now delisted Charlie Lazio and Blake Jury, and the recently retired Jaden Stevenson. There's probably an obvious 3 or 4 best players in this position: Cam Zurhaar, Paul Curtis, and Jai Simpkin, to a lesser extent, Eddie Ford as well. From there, Zane Dersma and Jaden Stevenson both had 20 out of 51. Not only due to the potential, but also Stevenson's retirement, you probably would have gone Dersma. There was just more there. But it's not much of a discussion anymore, so let's move to the mid and medium forward key stats charts. While there are some spots to improve, there are things that generally look good enough as well, and I can only assume with the addition of Parker and maybe even Daniel that this just improves in 2025. But we'll look at some projected changes in a second. Finally, let's look at the forwards output as a whole against that of a top 4 forward line, where we can see every stat bar crumbs is below par. This is where North will want to see improvement from their incoming players and from their younger forwards in Ford, Dersma and Curtis in the future. So let's go to Dylan. What do you think of my assessments of North's best 22 forward line, and do you think the smaller forwards are something that needs to be improved upon going forward?
I do. So I'll start off with saying that the players that you read out there, like your Stevensons, your Fords, your Dersma, if you're playing those as they're too tall for a small brigade. And I think like players like Curtis and even Drury when he's been in there, they're pretty good ground level players. They probably don't apply quite enough pressure just up against the competition's best. So it's more the ball coming on the way out. And when you're playing, a couple of big tall key forwards in Larky and Teakle, and then you got Dersmer and Ford and these players all in the team, it's just a little bit immobile. So I think you have to go a little bit smaller, and I think that's where Luke Parker is really going to come into this team. I think he's going to play more forward than midfield. He's going to rotate between those two positions, and I think he'll give a little bit of grunt in the midfield, but I think certainly he's going to help with that, just assist with that ground ball game, but more importantly, lay pressure and just get the structure a little bit better with some of those younger guys coming through.
Now that we have a comprehensive overview of the best 22, let's move to the postseason. So at this point, I've mentioned some people's ratings versus the average 2024 player and some people's ratings against the top 4 average. So let's zoom out for a second and make sure that everyone's above average numbers are top 4 numbers. From there, let's also highlight the players with 50% or more of their stats above a top 4 average. Now that we have North's best team from this last year, before we dive into which players will come into the next year's team and what that means for the output of North Melbourne, let's quickly show the players that didn't play this year. Now for the best 22 swaps going into 2025. With the addition of Jack Darling from West Coast, I would be looking at kicking Pink out of the side, as I would still want some assistance for Cherry. With Treacle's ability to pinch hit as a ruck and as a key position forward, he also provides some relief for Darling too. Finally, with a 3 key position defensive structure, most days aren't going to be a worry if one of the 3 gets injured. With the addition of Caleb Daniel from the Western Bulldogs, I'm not sure that he's an immediate in, as when comparing to top 4 players, he doesn't come across as a major upgrade from the existing players, at least from his efforts from last year. For now, I see him mainly putting pressure on Will Phillips, Bailey Scott, Eddie Ford, Paul Curtis, Jackson Archer, and Zach Fisher to perform. He also provides some reliable backup for injury. He gets a spot in the team now for Will Phillips, but only just. Luke Parker is a different story though. He is an immediate in, putting pressure on almost all the same people, and for me solidifies the fact that Will Phillips misses out. He also means that probably Bailey Scott misses out at the starting side, but he would be my first inclusion back with the current available players. So before we discuss who North should be looking to draft, let's look at the potential changes in the team's output with the new additions and where they should still look to improve the most. So let's look at the differences between 2024 and the potential 2025 charts. The additions to the team didn't really affect defense or ruck charts, so let's look at the midfield before we look at the forward line. When looking at the average output differences, there aren't really major drop-offs anywhere when replacing the likes of Phillips and Scott with rotating players, in this instance Simpkin and McDonald's. Things are just slightly up and down across the board. So let's look to the forward line, as the potential changes there are frankly just grander. Looking at North's potential changes in forward line stats, we can see almost every key stat bar contested marks improves on a difference of just 2.72 disposals. This just looks like a more efficient forward line, and while I don't think it'll have North competing for top 4, it will go a long way to fixing the consistent score involvement problems we've discussed throughout this video. So how much can North improve in 2025? Well, that remains to be seen, and I will do some prediction videos as we get closer to next season. Before we get into the draft, what do you think of the ins still? Do you think they're going to get North into the top 8 or at least rising up the ladder?
So I think the ones that I'm probably the most excited about as a North fan, I'm looking at Darling to have an impact as that second tall forward, lay a little bit more pressure inside forward 50 and just be like an experienced forward that has a little bit of craft, that knows what he's doing and can help out Larky a little bit. I'm pretty excited about that one, and we didn't pay too much for him as far as draft capital. The other is Luke Parker. I think a player like that gets into any side he's playing good enough football. We saw what he did in the grand final, kicking 3 goals in the second half, and some of his performances to work his way back into that really talented Sydney team towards the end of the year. I think he's only 31, maybe 32. So somewhere around that age, and it's not super old in the modern game. So I think what he's going to do, I'm really excited about. I'm probably less excited about Caleb Daniel. I just sort of feel like we have quite a few of those types anyway, and I probably would have liked to have seen the growth come from within the club. Someone like a Zach Fisher, I still have hopes that he can be a good player. Daniel, although he's got experience, he's been in successful teams and played in grand finals and stuff like that. I probably don't see him as an exceptional player from a leadership point of view and an on-field point of view. So less excited about that one, and even less excited when you add in the fact that he cost us a top 30 pick in what I would call a very, very deep and strong draft. So I think Darling and Parker, they make us better. Like you said, I don't think they make us better enough to crack the top 8. I think if that's to happen, it has to be an organic growth from inside the club. We'll need to see a big shoot up in productivity from someone like a Wardlaw or a Paul Curtis. Again, he's going to have to go on top of what he already did this season.
So now, before we get into Dylan's area of expertise and I hand over to him, I'll quickly go over what I think North should do and who they should target. North currently just have picks 2 and 62, and I think everybody is looking for them to make a trade, and I think the most obvious one is Richmond. Richmond have a lot of picks early, and I think most people are thinking 6 and somewhere between 18 and 24, so I'm going to make my suggestions based off that premise. With pick 6, provided the Demons don't take him the pick prior, I'd have North selecting Alexander Toru. If he is off the table, I think this pick might go to Harry Armstrong. With pick 18 to 24, I'd have North selecting one of Luke Traynor, Job Shanahan, or one of the Whitlock twins, depending on if they want a forward or back. So what do you think of that call, Dylan? What are your thoughts on North's potential to trade pick 2, and who do you think they end up with in the draft?
Yeah, so I'll start with the trade. I think there's probably 2 genuine options in this conversation. The most obvious and the most likely, I think, is the Richmond one that you mentioned. I think it'd be pick 6 and pick 18. Maybe there's an argument you could do 10 and 11 bundled up. I think the fact that North are so keen to get Tyree, I think they'll be a little bit worried that pick 10 will be just slightly too late with teams like Melbourne and St Kilda. I think the other team that have interest in this pick 2 is probably St Kilda. If they can get the guy that they want, I think they'd be chasing, a Sam Lawler or a Finn O'Sullivan and could strike up a deal, maybe a bit of a deal with GWS for one of pick 7 and 8 for 15 and 16, and then send maybe 7 and 16 to North for 2. But I think they'd only do that. It's a bit of a long shot because I think they'd only do that if the right player was on the board for them to get up. And Richmond probably have a bit more leverage there with the players they want. So I think those will be the picks. As far as who I think North Melbourne should take, I'm absolutely with you on Alex Tyree. I think he's the best key position player in this draft, the one with the most upside, the most athleticism, like some of the stuff that he did at the Combine, and how you can actually see him do that on the field, I think is fantastic. His marking ability, and people don't talk about enough, I think, the fact that he's played all over the ground this season. He's played in the midfield. He's got great ground level skills. He's been able to go forward and look like one of the best forwards when he's played there as well. So he's got massive versatility. Where I'm going to deviate from you a little bit here is with the second pick. So we'll say it's 18 or 20, one of those kind of picks. I think North could pivot a little bit here. They've picked up Tyree, who they could potentially play as a key forward if they need him to. Plus, you look at players like Dawson, who they could bring back in that defensive stock area. I think they could go for someone like an Ollie Hannaford, who's a really manic, precious small forward, someone that can hit the scoreboard, but more importantly, just connect the midfield as a small, and he can play a little bit bigger as well. So he's got aerial ability. And I just love the way that he plays, the intensity. And I think a lot of players in that forward half of the ground could feed off what he does from a pressure point of view. And I've got a bit of a man crush on Ollie Hannaford, so I love the way that he plays, and I think that's like a part of this deal. North could go down the 2 talls route, like you said, but I think this would be a pretty astute, nice little deal at around pick 20.
Thanks, Del. And you can find his channel link in the description below. Definitely keep an eye on him as it gets closer to the draft, as he's certainly one of the more knowledgeable draft heads in the YouTube scene. Thank you for watching our assessment of North's 2024 team and what they should be looking at doing to get back to being a top 4 side. My name's Woody, and this is Wooden Spoon Data, the 18th best AFL channel on YouTube. If you like this video and you want to see more data-focused AFL content, click the subscribe button and the notification bell to be kept up to date. Thanks for watching.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, sure. What up?
I've just been noticing that every time I leave to go out, the next time I open the computer, the browser history's been cleared.
Well, I think sometimes the computer runs an automatic software update, so maybe that just kind of clears the history.